Hello, everybody. Hello. Just making sure the sound works. Hello, everybody. Hello. I'm so glad to have you joining in to me today, with me today. Sorry, I'm getting all these messages all at one time. Hello, everybody. Hi. It's so great to see you as we finish up and wrap up this quilt project, y'all. This is going to be a little mini marathon. Hello, everybody. Lori, you're retired. You get to join us on Fridays. That is awesome. Hello, everybody. Yes, the Queen's passing. Such sad news. Wow, what a life she led, right? 96 years old. 96 years young, right? We will be celebrating her life. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Yes, a mini marathon. Today we're going to be doing the last block, block number 16. The free pattern is down in the description box. I hope you get it. You want to know what else is in the description box? The information for our next quilt project, which we're going to be starting on Friday, October the 7th. So we're going to have a couple Fridays where we're not coming live. I know Lori just retired and she could join us live, and this is the last live for a little while on Fridays. But we're coming back with a completely free Quilt As You Go project. It's going to be a lot of fun. If you want to see information on that, you can download those sheets down in the description box, and I'm going to show you those sheets as we wrap up towards the end of today's video. Hello, everybody. Hello. Miss Sheila, I have not forgotten about you. I have had a week. It's been a week. I still want to go to the quilt shop to shop fabrics specifically for this next project. So maybe this weekend or beginning of next week, let me know. Send me a message. Hello, everybody. If you are on Patreon, don't forget we're doing our monthly Zoom show and tell, chatting, and the block of the month workshop next Wednesday evening. Hello, everybody. Kathy, you got some tea stain muslin. Yay! That is awesome. Hello, everybody. Hello. It's so great to see you. Okay, so we have a lot to do. We're going to do the block number 16, the little apple, and then we're going to join the rows at the very bottom, and then we're going to join that row to our quilt, and we're going to throw on a binding today. So I know that many of you will be leaving to watch today's live events, so feel free to come back on the replay, okay? Thank you so much. All right, let's switch over to the cutting mat. Y'all, do you see my background is different? After all of the work yesterday that we did, I tore down the studio and I rearranged. And I just did get everything hooked back up. You don't want to see the rest of the room. It's only straight behind me. And I was in here until like 11:30 last night, just trying to plug stuff in to get ready for today. But yeah, I rearranged. Okay. Cutting mat. Here we go. Thank you so much, Dari, for moderating today. I understand you might have to leave, but thank you so much for keeping an eye on the chat while you're here. Let's take a look at our stuff for today. Y'all, my big block is so cute. So I did a combination of things, right? Heat transfer vinyl for the words, fabric applique for the apple and the circle, and I did this really fun checkerboard quilting. Isn't that awesome? So that is my last large block for this quilt, and if you want to get the pattern for this, the link for it is down in the description box. We're going to be making the smaller block today. Hello, everybody. Move that out of the way. And I'll bring in our pieces, and we're going to get straight to work. because we have a lot to do today. All right, let me get this iron warming up, and let me grab a glue stick. I love opening a new glue stick. It's so clean and pretty. I'm just going to add a little bit of glue in there while that iron is warming up, and we're going to put this batting right in the middle and give that a press from this side. Just to dry that glue. We're going to set that off to the side for a second, and I'm going to go ahead and glue baste my pieces. Now just keep in mind that we will have seam allowances on all four sides, so just keep that in mind when positioning your pieces. I'm going to put the leaf right there, and the stem just like that. And we're going to go ahead and fuse those pieces down. Catherine said, nice to hear you enjoying the simpler things, a new glue stick. I love a new glue stick. So that's fused in place, and now we can just baste this right to our little mini quilt sandwich. I have some black thread in my sewing machine. That's been the trend for all of my blocks, is to use a black thread, which is kind of nice because it forms a little outline around all of our pieces. Hello, Miss Vicky. How are you feeling today? Thank you so much for keeping an eye on the chat. And we're going to let that cool off for just a second, y'all, because there's one little line detail, or there's actually a couple, right? You could put the little vines in the leaves. And then there's the little line detail that kind of just gives some shape to this apple. And I'm going to just draw that on there with a heat erasing pen. If I was really just doing this on my own, I probably would have done a little chain stitch by hand for this line detail, and possibly the line detail in the leaves. To save a little bit of time today, we're going to do that with the machine. Yes, it's a regular Elmer's washable school glue stick. That's what that is. Let's cool this off so this line doesn't disappear. And I'm just going to eyeball it and draw that in. My line might look a little different than yours, but it's just a basic little loose shape like that. It might not even be showing up on the screen. All right, we're going to move on over to the sewing machine. We're going to get this part done. I think I will do, what kind of stitch do we want to do? Maybe a little satin stitch? I hope that, I rigged my camera up, you can kind of see it. I hope it's not too wobbly. I was kind of getting things ready at the last minute. All right, let's choose a satin stitch. For many of you, it would be a zigzag stitch if you want to use the same stitch. Let's test out some different ones here. that's not too wobbly, is it? All right, right here towards the bottom, that's the satin stitch that I'm going to use. And so my settings, which might be different on your machine, but if you want to try this stitch, the width is 2.0, okay? And the length is a 0.4, and we're going to go with that. So where do we want to start? Let's go ahead and start right here, this part of the apple, and we're going to work our way all the way around. I am going to do a little back stitch. Oh, my thumb's going to be in the way. And just bring that stitch right up to the edge of that stem. I can see I might have to move my camera. This is going to give a nice little bold outline around the apple shape. Working our way around. I'm just going to cut this little string right there. Isn't that a nice little outline? I'm going to stop right here when the apple gets to the leaf, and then without breaking thread, I'm just going to continue right around that leaf. I'm going to stop with my needle in the right position, and we're going to pivot. And so when I start, it's going to go into the leaf fabric when it stitches to the left, right? I think that's probably the most confusing part of learning the zigzag and satin stitch, is where to start and stop when you're making these turns. At the point, you'll see me turn it like halfway around, and I'll take a couple little stitches and then pivot again. That just helps me get a nice little point at the tips of the leaf. All right, I just passed where I started just by a couple of stitches, and I'm going to just jump over and hit this little area between the leaf and the stem. It's a tiny little area of red right there. Whoops. I was in the wrong position, Lisa. And again. And when I get to the stem, again, without breaking thread, I'm going to go right around the stem. Now the stem is a little bit thinner, so I'm going to reduce the width of my satin stitch to a 1.6, okay? It's still set at 0.4 for the length. And I'm going to use that same little satin stitch to do the little line detail right in this area. Just doing a little back stitch there. And when I end this, I will do a little back stitch, and I'm going to cut the thread on that. So there is our apple all stitched. Pretty cute, right? All right, let's go ahead and trim these little jump stitches. And this is the last block for this quilt, y'all. There we go. So this is how it looks from the back. It's pretty cute, right? And there she is from the front. So we have a ton of work left to do, right? Because we're going to join these 4 blocks into a row. Oh, I forgot the lines of the leaf. We'll just leave it the way it is. I think it looks fine that way. Let's see. Let's bring in this. It's not going to all fit into the screen here, but I am going to scoot it up just a little bit. We're going to be working on this very last row, right? And I've already attached the sashing strips underneath of row 3. And we're going to place these blocks like this. I think that'll look cute, right? Just like that. Marian said, the hardest part for her when doing the satin stitch is knowing which side to have the needle on. What is an easy way to remember this? What I say to myself when I'm doing a satin stitch and turning my work as I'm stitching, if I'm rotating the piece to the left to make a curve, the needle needs to be in the left. If I'm rotating the piece to the right to make a turn, the needle needs to be in the right before I make that turn. All right, so up until this point, I've just been joining all of these blocks together before we come live, right? But I have had a few people ask if I could show the process. So we're going to do that, okay? Now, here's the thing, y'all. At the beginning of this series, I did a video showing how I join my blocks together using sashing on the front and the back like this. I did modify the measurements just a little bit for this particular quilt project because I fell in love with this black flannel fabric and it is super thick and it's a little bit harder to work with. So I have made my top sashing strip a little bit longer to accommodate the thickness, okay? So my strips might look a little bit different than yours. What I have is a 1-inch strip that goes on the back, okay? That's the same. But my top strip for the front, I cut at 1.5 inches. And you might actually find it easier to cut your strips anyway at 1.5 inches. In that video, I showed it cutting at 1 inch, which is usually what I like to do. But this flannel is thick. I had almost... Well, originally when I thought about using this flannel, I had thought about using the flannel as the binding too, but I'm not going to torture myself using this flannel as a binding. So I've made a binding out of regular quilter's cotton. It doesn't exactly match this sashing, but it's super cute, right? So I have 3 strips. We have 1, 2, 3 seams in between these 4 blocks, right? Just like this. So what I'm going to do is we'll start with this first block. We're going to put the 1-inch strip pretty side, the right side, facing the back of the strip, just like this. Right? We're going to line up that raw edge. And then we're going to put the 1.5-inch strip, 1 inch maybe in your case, with the right side facing the block. And we're going to bring this to the sewing machine and we're going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to trim away, once we're done, all of this extra, okay? I like to have a little bit of extra there. You could cut your strips exactly the size of your blocks if you want to. Now, while we're at the sewing machine, we're going to stay there, and I'm going to join all of these pieces while we're there, and then we'll come back to the cutting table, okay? Gammy Stitcher, I'm so glad you're here. All right, we're going to switch over to the sewing machine. I am going to change this little foot right here. I like to use this foot when I'm doing a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to set my seam allowance for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. But I'm going through quite a bit of thickness. You can see that flannel, cotton, batting, cotton, and another flannel piece. I'm going to increase my stitch length to a 2.4 just to help ease all of that through there. So we're going to make sure that all of those raw edges are nice and lined up. And then we're going to line up this top piece. And we are sewing that with a 1/4 inch seam. All right, so I'm not going to do anything with this top piece right yet, okay? But this bottom piece, I am going to flip that over and give it a really sturdy finger pressing, okay? I really want to work that seam and really give it a nice little press. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to bring in the second block, right? And we're going to, and I find it helpful just to lay it out just like this, with the right sides of the blocks facing up, right? And then flip it over, right? So on the bottom, it's going to look like this. And we're going to line up, sorry, my eyes work better this way. I'll show you here in just a second. We're going to line up not only this raw edge, but we're going to make sure that this stays nice and straight, right? These two blocks. And now we're sewing this sashing piece and the block underneath of it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You could give that a press with the iron before doing this if you want to. So now when we open this up, this should just nest right in that sashing, right? We're going to give it a press before we move on to the next step, but we're going to add all of the blocks. This is how it looks on the back. So now we repeat the process. Right over here, we're going to bring in a 1-inch strip, and in my case, the 1.5 inch strip. This goes right side up, and we're matching up that raw edge. And this top strip goes right side facing down. Again, we're going to turn it over, and we're going to give this sashing a good little finger press. And then we're going to bring in our third block. It's laying right side up just like this. So I know if I flip it over, sorry, I have to do it off camera. You can see me up here. I like to look at it like this and line up the blocks and that raw edge nice and straight. Like that. See that? So I know everything is going to be straight across. All right, so we can open that up. Again, we are going to press these seams before doing anything with these top sashings. So there's our third block. We can bring in our last two sashing pieces. Ooh, you just joined my Patreon. Ooh, I hope you join us Wednesday evening. It would be great to see you. All right, our thinner sashing, right side facing up. We're going to line that up to that raw edge, nice and straight. And then the last sashing strip for the top goes face down. One more time, we're going to flip this over and give this sashing a good little press. I really work it in there since I'm not ironing it. I just don't want to go back and forth with the camera. All right, so we can bring in our last block for this row. Pretty side up, and then we flip it, and again you'll see me over here. Nice and straight with that raw edge and with the block underneath of it. And we sew this seam. Just make sure it's nice and lined up. All right, so all of our blocks are joined and it looks like a hot mess, right? Let me move this out of the way. We're going to come back to the cutting mat for just a minute. Okay, so here she is. It looks like a big hot mess, right? So let me wake up my iron one more time. What I want to do is go ahead and just press these seams so that these blocks lay nice and flat, right? The edges, the raw edges of these blocks should just be touching right in that sashing. I like to use a little burst of steam. All right, so from the back, it looks nice and finished, right? So for the front, what I like to do, and I find useful, is use a little glue. In my video, I showed using a piece of like cardstock, which is really helpful. Because this is flannel and I cut it a little bit wider, there's a little bit more room to actually glue baste this. So I'm just going to bring that raw edge right to that stitch line with just a swipe of glue. Dry it. And then one more swipe of glue and flip it right on over. Boy, she is thick. That's a lot of layers of flannel. Peggy, I really feel like it's a personal preference, right? Peggy asked if she's not using flannel, should the top sashing be cut at 1 inch or 1.5? I really feel like I like the 1 inch if I'm just using regular fabric. But at 1.5, you have more fabric to handle and to work with. Do you know what I'm saying? The finished look is the same, so it all depends on what is really easiest for you, I think. We're going to repeat the process. I'm going to bring that raw edge right to that stitch line. Let's just go ahead and do that like this. Fold it over again, and I will give that a press. See how nice and pretty that is? All right, we're gonna fold this one over. And fold it over one more time, and we're going to press and dry that glue. Now I'm not yet cutting off the extra wonkiness parts of the sashing that stick above and below. Just because I find it a little bit helpful to have that there while I'm stitching this sashing closed, right? Because we still do have to at least stitch this side so that it's permanently stitched down, right? But when we stitch down this side, I like to make it uniform and also stitch along this side, right? Just to kind of make it look like it's intentional, right? To make sure that I'm stitching within this piece of the sashing, I have been stitching this part on the back. You could stitch it from the front or the back. I just find it helpful to stitch right on the back. I'm going to switch this foot back over so hopefully you can see. And I'm even going to put on my zipper foot. So we're going to go back to the sewing machine, and from the back, I'm going to stitch right in the sashing on both sides of these 3 strips, okay? Yeah, I love the glue basting. All right, so I have my zipper foot on. That just helps me get right along the edge, right close to the edge. And I'm just doing a straight stitch. So I actually start in the extra fabric that sticks off, and we're going to cut that off. And because of the thickness, my stitch length is set at 2.4, and I'm just using a straight stitch. So I just sew right off of the edge and then turn everything around and then come right back down the other side. I found that if I stitch my pieces from the front, see that sashing? Oh, see the sashing on the front? It comes over onto this block a little bit. I found that when I was stitching it on the front, I was sometimes stitching off of the sashing on the back. So for me, I just find it easier just to stitch these lines from the back. We're going to flip it around and we'll come back the other way on this middle sashing. And we have one more. Hear that thickness? I do love this flannel, but it is thick. Okay. So here it is from the front. I stayed within that sashing for sure on the front, but stitching it from the back, I ensure that I'm not stitching off of that back sashing, right? All right, so all we have left to do, let me get a pair of scissors. I'm just going to eyeball it and snip off these ends. You could certainly use a ruler and a rotary cutter, but I'm just going to snip, 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 and clean up these edges. I should have brought over my good scissors, my really good sharp scissors for this. These raw edges are going to be covered by binding and by another sashing strip. All right, so there's all my little nuggets. And here is the finished row for the very bottom. So that's how I've been joining my pieces to form my rows, right? Yeah, Annette said you can hear the machine working on that thickness, and it is thick too. All right, so at this point, we're ready to join this row to the bottom of our quilt. And I had already added a sashing strip to that very last bottom row. All right, so the sashing strips were longer than, I think this measures 20.5 inches wide. Just like these smaller sashings, it was longer, and I joined it and squared it up, right? The first thing we're going to do is, just like with these little rows, we're going to attach this row to that back sashing, right? So I'm just going to take this and this so I don't get mixed up. Take them together and flip it just like that, right? So on the back side, this is what it'll look like. We want to make sure that that top sashing stays nice and flat to the body of the quilt so we're not sewing it in there, right? We're going to line that up just like that. That's what the back is going to look like. We're actually going to sew it from the front. All right, here we go. Because there's no extra, let me put my other foot on. I'm going to start with just a little leader just to get started with the stitching. Back to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Back to 2.4 as the stitch length. All right. My goal is to make sure all the edges of the row underneath and this raw edge, everything is nice and lined up really straight. All right, so I'm going to bring it in just like this. We're going to move that top sashing over. And we're sewing this one. You'll see with this longer seam that I'll stop and just make sure that everything is staying nice and lined up all the way down. cannot believe. Y'all, we started this project 16 weeks ago. That is a lot of weeks. All right. So just like what we did, hold on one second. Just like what we did with the smaller blocks, you'll want to flip your top sashing over, right? And I'm going to glue baste this in place, but I'm going to give this a good little press first, so that everything just lays nice and flat. Tammy, do not even say that. Do not even say that. One thing you have to keep in mind is how long have you been sewing, right? You certainly cannot compare your work to anyone else's who has a lot more years under their belt, a lot more experience under their belt, and just enjoy the process along the way. Annette said, what size needle are you using? I'm using an 80, hold on one second, I'll show you. Universal 8012. And that's going through all these thicknesses. I'm quite surprised. Now, y'all, as far as this top sashing, I've already folded it to that stitch line, right? I did that when I joined it to the top of the quilt. So I'm ready to just glue baste this right over top of that seam. And I don't want to add a lot of glue. It just takes a really light little swiping of glue, right? Really light. And I'm going to give a little burst of steam here and there to help dry that glue. I want to be careful right around there because I don't know what that lace is made out of. And I'm not sure if it's heat sensitive or not. Y'all, we've had so much fun throughout these blocks. While this is cooling off and that glue finishes drying, let's just do a recap of all of these blocks because we've done some fun stuff. We did a couple of hand stitches, right? The very first week we did a chain stitch by hand. We've applied buttons and beads. We've done some hand quilting. I did some bead work down here with the butterfly. That's a paper bead. I actually made that bead during a video a couple years ago. We used some sequins. I even used some silver nail polish after this video to give a little details. So I'm all about thinking outside of the box when it comes to embellishing our quilt projects, right? So once that final row is on, she should be square, right? 20.5 by 20.5, I believe. Sheila said, which is your favorite? Well, I have to say, because we have a black cat, his name is Ashley. I'm going to go with that one. If I had to pick an all-time favorite, Sheila, I would say that one. But then you know my love of coffee and tea, so this one might be a close second just because of the cup. Don't you love the chicken, though? It's hard to pick a favorite. Thank y'all so much. All right, so this is cooling down. Just like we did with these sashing strips, I'm going to sew them from the back side. Okay, so let's flip back on over. I'm going to switch this foot first. There we go. Again, I'm just using a straight stitch. I'm going to move that needle so that it just does line up with the edge of that zipper foot. And my stitch length is set at 2.4. I'm going to use a little leader. And we're going to bring this in and stitch it from the back side. Because that sashing on the front is glue basted, I'm not worried about it shifting and moving. Now I have some really thick intersections because of that flannel, so I'm just going to go really slow through that. And I'm going to lift that needle up and we're coming back the other way, which means we have to fold this to fit it into the throat of our sewing machine. I don't want that to be in the way. There. I will tell you, I give props to those of you who join Quilt As You Go with the big quilts. I do think I just struggle once the project gets like this size. I really struggle with it, so I give a lot of props to those who do great big quilts. Quilt As You Go. The next project, and we'll talk about that here in a minute, we're joining the blocks a little bit differently, which might be easier for the bigger quilts. There we go. I know my machine is like, yes, thank you, you're done. All right, let's come back. All right. So for those of you who missed when I joined this bottom row or joined the sashing in between those blocks, I personally like to stitch mine from the back on this project because my sashing sticks into my next block just a little bit on the front. And when I stitch it over on the back, if I stitched the sashing right to the edge on the front, I would have a stitching line that runs through the back of my quilt block. Okay, see, it's a little bit wider on the front. Had I used a thinner sashing strip on the front, it probably would not be an issue and I would sew it from the front. But to avoid accidentally getting a line on the back of my quilt, I just found it easier for this particular project to stitch the sashing from the back. That way I know it's going to stitch down the front, but I'm also not creating a line through my block on the back. So there she is. There is my bottom row, and she is attached. So let me pull over the binding. This is just regular quilter's cotton, and I know my machine is so thankful. Originally, I thought about doing the same flannel fabric as the binding, but as I've progressively worked through the weeks on this, I changed my mind on that, and I know my machine is thankful. This is just a regular quilter's cotton, and if you got the first sheet, you'll know that if you have about a 1/4 yard of fabric that's 43 inches wide, if you got 3 strips of that, that would be enough to bind this little quilt project. And I cut my binding at 2.5 inches. You could cut it a little less if you prefer to do that. But this was cut at 2.5 inches wide. And we're going to bind this project together, and when we're done, she's going to be all finished. Okie doke. Where do you start your binding when you're binding a project? I will tell you, when I first started doing binding, I joined my ends of my binding together in a very simple way. It did create a little bulky join, and so I would start my binding at the bottom, or like at the very lower right side, just so that it wouldn't be so noticeable. But today we're joining our binding in the correct way. So I don't know that it much matters where we start and stop, so we're going to start over here on the right. So let's find the end of the binding, which is right here. Here's my ends. I like to have a couple pins. And this is just how I do my binding, y'all. There are millions of binding videos here on YouTube, not just mine, but other really helpful quilters who share lots of really good information. So if this doesn't make sense to you, or you already know this, you might want to check out some other YouTube videos that might show it in a little bit of a different way. This is just how I do it. Anitra says halfway down on the right side of the front, then hand stitch it to the back. I love a hand stitch binding on the back. I just do not have the patience. I'm working on that though. I really am. Marie said 2.5 is my go-to also. I do it in the middle, class F to the side to start. Awesome. Tammy, you still have the chicken and the apple left to do yet. You're coming along. You're coming along. Okay, so this is the raw edge of the binding. This is the folded edge, right? We're going to line the raw edge up to the raw edge of our quilts. And y'all, I just like to throw a pin in here. We're not going to start sewing right at the cutoff mark. We're going to start sewing down here. This is going to give us some room to join the binding after we've come all the way around, right? So I like to give myself at least 10 inches. This is a smaller quilt. 10 to 12 inches of working room to join those ends is what I like to do. So without pulling tension on the binding, I'm going to lay it down nice and flush. And I'm going to come right down here to this chicken block, and I'm going to throw a pin right there. And that's where we're going to start sewing this binding on, right down towards the bottom. Okay? So which foot do I have We're playing switch the foot back and forth, back and forth. I like to use my just standard foot with a 1/4 inch seam to join my binding. Because I am going through not only the thickness of the quilt, but where my sashing comes along the edges, that's pretty thick. I'm going to use a little bit of a longer stitch length to attach the binding to the front. Okay, I have mine set at 2.4. All right, now let me switch over to the sewing machine. We're going to start stitching down this binding, y'all. And I do want to move this stool because I've been stretching to see, and I just don't think that that works very much for me. There we go. All right, so again, we're not going to start right up here. We're going to come down to this second pin. That's going to give us a good amount to work with, right? We're coming down, which means we'll be doing a corner pretty quick. Right below that pin, I'm going to take a couple stitches and do a couple of back stitches just to lock that stitch in there really well. I'm going to sew down, and I'm just eyeballing it, y'all. You could measure if you really wanted to, but I'm going to eyeball and stop about 1/4 inch away from this raw edge here at the bottom. Now, if your machine doesn't have a little thread cutter that knots your work, you might want to take a couple of back stitches right here just to lock that in place before you pull everything away. All right, so we're going to do our first corner. The binding's coming down this way. We're going to fold it, and your binding is going to look like an L, right? We're going to match up the raw edge of this binding to the raw edge of the bottom of our quilt. Just like that. This should go nice and straight right across the bottom. And I like to just finger press that fold just like that. And then I'll take my little finger and hold it down right there, and we're going to take this binding and flip it onto our quilt. That's going to give us a nice little mitered corner. Now you could throw a little pin in there if that helps you keep it all lined up. Because it's a smaller quilt, I feel like I can move this around without losing anything. And I like to just bring it and line it up with my foot. I like to take a couple stitches and then I back stitch all the way to the edge of the quilt. That's just me. I'm back stitching all the way to the edge of that quilt, and now we will continue on. And we're just making sure this binding is nice and lined up with the edge of our quilt. I'm going to go a little bit slower over top of that flannel. I will tell you, for years I avoided doing bindings. I did. we're approaching this next corner. Again, I'm going to stop about 1/4 of an inch away from this raw edge. Again, you might want to take a couple back stitches. That's just going to help really lock that stitch in there so your binding doesn't come loose. Because next we're going to turn this binding just like that. We're going to line that up. Finger press that little fold and then fold it right back on top of the quilt. I'm going to hold it right there in place. Again, you could throw some pins in there if you want. I'm going to line it up to my presser foot. Take a couple stitches. And I like to back stitch all the way to the edge of the quilt. Just make sure if you do that your back stitch stays nice and straight along the edge of that quilt. All right, and now we're sewing down this side. Just lining up that binding as we go along. You can see sometimes I'll lift up my quilt just to relieve a little bit of tension, because sometimes, especially the larger the quilt, the more it starts to feel like it wants to pull, and your line might go a little wonky. Again, we're going to stop 1/4 of an inch away. Back stitch. We are doing our 3rd corner. Fold that right on over. Finger press that little fold a little bit. And flip it onto your quilt. Line it on up. I probably should have used a different color thread so you could see that stitch line. Take a couple of stitches and I'm backing all the way up. Now we're going to line up this binding. Cute little puppy dog. All right, we're coming to this last corner. back stitch. Sorry, my thumb is in the way. We're doing this last corner just the same way. Fold it over. I think I took one stitch too much, so I'm just going to come in with my little clips and I'm going to clip one little tiny stitch, okay? So if you go too far, it's okay. Just clip one stitch. That'll let you line it up nice and straight along the bottom. Fold it back onto the quilt. We're going to start this off just like we have all the other sides. My finger's in the way. I backed up all the way to the edge of the quilt. Now here is where we started, and that's just pinned in place. I'm going to come to about right here, do a back stitch, and cut the thread, and we're going to finish and connect the ends of these bindings. Right about there, I'm going to back stitch. That's going to keep it nice and tight where we left off, right? So let's come over here and I'm going to show you how I join these two ends. All right, cutting mat. Here we go. I have myself a little handy dandy ruler. And you can see we have quite a bit. Well, I say quite a bit. Maybe half a yard of extra binding. I always like to have a little extra than not enough, right? So here we are. Let's take the pins out. So we still have this open area on our quilt, right? I wonder if it'll make more sense to have it like that. There we go. All right, so I like to join it kind of here in the middle. So let's just lay this down. I am going to cut a little section of this right off, okay? Right about there. Nice and straight across. Then I'm going to take the very end of my binding since we have so much extra, right? And I just cut myself a little chunk of that. And I'm going to open this binding up. And this binding was cut at 2.5 inches wide. I like to use the back side because it stands apart away from the actual front of the fabric, right? We're going to cut off this extra binding, but we're going to give ourselves 2.5 inches, the same measurement as our binding. So if you cut your binding differently, your extra will be a different, right? The same thickness of your binding. With this laid nice and flat against our quilt, I'm going to line that up just like that. I'm going to take this binding where we left off and just lay that right over top. Now I'm not pulling, I'm not stretching, but it's also not very loose. Do you know what I'm saying? It's just sitting nice and flush against our quilt. So now we're going to cut where we left off on this extra binding right at the edge, and that's going to give us our extra binding so we can join this at a diagonal, right? I wish I had my longer scissors. I like to trim this off, not exactly flush with this edge. I like to come in about 1/8 of an inch away so there's no extra pulling of my binding, okay? Just a smidgen shorter, like that. See that? About that much shorter. That's going to really snug this binding to the quilt without it being too tight. So we have about this much extra binding from the 3 strips. I save all that and make scrappy bindings, so that will not get thrown away. All right, this will become little leaders. Now, this might be the most confusing part, and it was the most intimidating part for me anyway, and what kept me from doing bindings for so long is actually joining these two sections of binding, right? I'm going to try to do this so it fits in the camera. So we have where we left off, and we have the extra where we started. I'm just going to pull those off to the side a little bit. And to make it easier, I'm going to fold this quilt in like that, okay? And I'm just going to throw a little pin in here to help keep it together because we're working with this. And right now, none of this matters, right? So where we left off, we're going to pull this binding and I'm going to open it up. You see, I glue basted my bindings. I'm just going to tug on that and open it up nice and flat. So there's the edge of our binding. Here's the binding where we started. I'm going to open that one up. Mary Jo, I'm just eyeballing my 1/4 inch when I stop at the corners. I'm just eyeballing it. All right, so here is this binding, and there is that binding. This one is pulled over to the side, opened up. The fold is coming up. This is the pretty side facing up, and this is going to be pretty side facing down. And we're going to match up the left edge and the top edge of that binding. See that? My face is in the way. Let's scoot it down some. There we go, Lisa. We're going to line up those raw edges. And I like to just throw a pin in there towards that corner and towards this section here. Now, what I find really, really helpful is just to take a pen and a ruler and see underneath that bottom sashing has that little corner there. I like to make myself a little mark right there. And then just draw on the diagonal, corner to corner. So what I would do, I would sew the wrong corner to corner getting started. When I first started learning how to do binding, I would sew from this corner to that corner and then realize that I had to pick it out and do it again. So we're sewing from this top left corner down to this bottom corner. Okay? Teresa said, why do you glue baste your binding? I find it really helpful when I'm attaching my binding. Have you ever been attaching your binding and you notice that you start to have extra, and so you do little tucks in your binding? Have you ever, or is that just me that happens to? Before I started glue basting my bindings, I would find that here and there I'd have to do little tucks with my binding because there would be extra fabric. So now when I make my binding, I just run a little small baste of glue and everything stays exactly where it's supposed to. All right, we're going to bring this over to the sewing machine. And I'm going to throw a little leader in there. I'm going to lower my stitch length to a 2.0. And we're bringing this over. And we're sewing directly right on that line. All right, we can cut this little leader off. Let's come back to the cutting mat, because before I trim off this extra, I always double check. I always double check because I do get sidetracked. I get distracted, and I don't want to cut off that extra bit of triangle before I open this up and make sure that I did indeed sew the right corner together. So your binding should just lay nice and flat like that, right? If it doesn't, if it's twisted, you've sewn it from the wrong corner to the wrong corner. You can pick that out and re-sew the other corners before you trim this off. So after I check, I just trim and leave myself about 1/4 of an inch seam. And I just take my, ooh, look, we were right next to the seam of the binding. I just open up that seam and just run my fingernail through it. You could iron this seam if you want. I just set the seam and finger press it open. Just use my little fingernail and kind of work that seam nice and flat. And now it should just lay nice and snug right against the edge of your quilt. So we're going to pick back up. We stopped stitching here. I know you can't see because it's black thread. I'm going to come in right above that. We're going to do a back stitch, and then we're going to sew all the way down to where we started sewing our binding on. So again, 1/4 inch and a 2.4 for my stitch length. Right here is where we stopped stitching. I'm going to come in right above it. Stitch, 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 back stitch. And now we are just finishing off this binding to the front. And it should just be laying nice and snug right up against your quilt without any extra. Right here is where we started. Back stitch. So at this point, the binding is completely attached to the front of our quilt, right? Those of you who love to hand stitch the binding from the back, you're ready to get started, right? This is about the size of quilt that I could probably stand stitching the binding to the back before I completely lose all interest in doing that. All right, so for me, I'm just going to do it by machine, right? So I'm going to just flip this right on over. You could use binding clips or pins. Today I'm going to use a little bit of glue. Let's trim and clean up some of these threads in the corners. Just a little bit. While that iron is warming up. My thread cutter leaves longer threads. There we go. I'm going to poke out these corners. Hi, honey. Hey. I'm going to poke out these corners first. You coming in to say hi to everybody? Y'all have to see Harmlin in his suit coat. Look how handsome he is.
Look how nice this is in here
Y'all look how handsome he is. Hold on a second. Oh, you're going to have to scoot down because you're so tall.
Everybody.
Look how handsome he is.
I had to get my photo done today at work, so I had to dress up a little bit.
Doesn't he look nice with a suit coat and tie?
I really get this organized.
I know, it's coming along.
It is.
It's a good thing they can't see over there. Over here, it's pretty straight. All right, y'all, I'm just going around and I'm flipping these corners out on my binding, right? And I like to do a little finger press right on those edges just to start working that binding to the back. Allie Creates said, would you show what the corner looks like when you unfold it on the front? Sure. So from the front, it's going to look like that, right? It's going to have a little crease that runs diagonal to the corner. And I'll show you that once we have sewn it down. But to the back, it's just going to pucker right around the back. My face was in the way. It's just going to pucker right around the back for right now. And I just like to work this binding, start getting it to lay flat along the edge, right? I do that for all my sides. Just working that corner out, working that binding nice. Yeah, he looks snazzy, right? He had to get his portrait done for work today. So that's two sides. Let's flip this around. Work that binding nice and flat. I use a little bit of steam. I know many of you don't put water in your iron. You certainly don't have to. All right, this is our last side. Right now those corners are just kind of puckered around. And you could start taking binding clips, right? And just fold that over and add a whole bunch of binding clips. You could certainly do that. Today, I'm just going to use a little bit of glue. Do I want to use a glue stick or... It's been a while since I used this. Let's break this out. So, you could certainly use a glue stick. Same glue stick I've been using throughout today's live, or you could use a little bit of wet glue. You could use the Elmer's school glue, right, with the chalkboard on the front. I've switched over to Glue All, which does wash out of your quilts once you're done, but it's a little bit stronger. And I'm just going to add a little bit of glue little dots here and there. It's going to act like a binding clips. You don't have to use a lot, just a few little dots will do, right? And I'm going to start folding that binding over. We're going to just fold, finger press that corner just like that. And I like to go ahead and press that crease. See that? And we're going to work our way, pulling that binding right over top of the back of our quilt. Maybe I did not put enough glue. There we go. I'm going to add a little bit right there. One thing you don't want to do is bring wet glue over to the sewing machine, so you want to make sure that you're just using enough for it to work, but also just enough so that when you go through and dry the glue, that it does get dry, right? And you're not bringing any wet glue over to your sewing machine. So there's the first side. We're going to flip it around. So that little corner is pressed. I don't like this long string. Let's clip that out of there. I also meant to bring over one of my tags. Let's do that. I want to add one of my labels to this. Sheila said Lisa's hurrying before. I think he's already changing. I'm going to add one of my little tags to this. So where is my glue stick? Ellie said, when you're stitching, this is my old glue stick, the messy one. When you're stitching it down on the back, how do you know the stitching will stay on the binding on the top? We're actually going to stitch it from the front, right? So when we fold our binding over on the back, see that stitch line right there? That's when we attached it to the front. When we bring our binding over to the back, we want to make sure that we cross over that line, right? We want to make sure that it goes past that stitch line. We're actually going to stitch it from the front right next to that binding. And when we do that, it's going to catch the back binding. Just going to add a little glue on my tag. Ooh, she got some frayed edges. All right, I'm just going to set that glue real quick. There we go. All right, so here's my little tag, and I want to put that right in here somewhere. I'm going to add a little bit of glue. Dots, 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 dots. Dots of glue right in that seam. I'm going to add a little dot right to this corner. And then I'm going to add a little extra glue right there and on my tag. Just like that. See that? We're going to start with this corner. So this corner has been pressed one time. We're going to fold it right over. That's going to give us a nice little mitered corner to the back side too. You'll have a little seam that runs right to the corner of our quilt, which might be a little hard to see because I used a black fabric for the binding, and it's just kind of blending in there. Valerie, yeah, I like to pull this binding right up to the edge of this quilt. So the binding is nice and full, and I like to make sure it's going over past that stitch line. So it's right up against the edge of the quilt for a nice full binding. Oh, the little fraying. There we go. So I get my little tag in there. Just use a little bit of steam. I don't want to get too hot around that label, but I do want to dry this glue. There we go. And I think I will put a little binding clip in there. Hold on one second. Right where this label is, just in case I didn't catch enough glue on that. There we go. So now we're going to flip it over. We're going to do the same thing on this side. A little touch of glue right on that corner. And I'm not using a lot, y'all. Just a smidgen. Just like that. You can even add the glue to your binding if you want. And we're folding over. Nice little corner that runs diagonal to the corner. Nice little line that runs diagonal to the corner. And we're pressing all the way across. Just drying that glue all the way across. All right, we have one more side left to do. So on this side, we have this binding that's folded over and pressed, and this binding that's folded over and pressed. I'm going to add a little dot of glue there, and a little dot of glue there. And y'all, it's just like using liquid pens. And again, the glue does wash out of your quilt. If you were to wash this, it would wash right on out. And I'm just using little dots. We're going to fold this right on over. I like to use a little burst of steam. To me, it just hurries along the process. So you'll see I'm just kind of not really tugging, but just firmly pulling that binding over to the back, up against the edge of the quilt. And just making sure that glue is good and dry. All right, so here it is from the back. So we are going to take this to the sewing machine one last time. And I personally like to use a zipper foot for this part, but you can use whichever foot you like. I like to use a zipper foot and have it so that the needle is on the right side of the zipper foot. I'm going to keep the same black thread. And we're coming over here. So I'm going to be stitching right next to that binding. Not on the binding and not really into our block, but right next to that binding. And because the binding on the back is folded over beyond that, see the extra binding? I will have a little flappy part of my binding. I'm okay with that. I cut it at 2.5 inches. So I will have a little flappy part on the back. All right. And I'm going to move the needle over so it just does come to the edge of my zipper foot. And I'm going to use the same 2.4. You could go a little less if you want to, but I am going to be sewing through some thick parts of flannel. So I'm going to do a 2.4 stitch length for my finishing stitch of our binding. So when I use the zipper foot rides right next to, butted up against that binding, and it just helps me stay right next to the edge. All right, I'm going to take a couple stitches. I'm not going to do a back stitch here. I'm going to pass where we start when we come back around. All right, with this little binding clip, I know my label is there. I just want to make sure it's still nice and straight, and I can take that binding clip out. have things in the way behind my quilt. Yeah, so right into that corner, lift that foot and just turn it right around. So you'll see with that zipper foot, I'm able to get right next to that binding and you don't even see that stitch on the front. And I'm able to just kind of zip right along. And the main thing I'm focusing on is the side of my binding foot touching my binding. That's what I'm really focused on instead of watching the needle and seeing if it's next to the binding. Stitch right into the corner, lift the foot and swing her right around. Isn't Harlan cute? He had to come show y'all his outfit. He does wear a suit really nicely, I will tell you that. Right into that corner. We're coming along the top edge now. I think we've moved along for our little mini marathon. We're still under 2 hours. Right into that corner, and we're coming back down, and we're going to pass where we started just by a couple of stitches. Right here, this little loose thread, that's where we started. And now I'll just do a couple little back stitches. And we can trim this front thread. And I will have a little bit of a thread nest on the back from my thread cutter. There we go. And there's the binding, y'all. She is done. Okay, let me move my stool one more time. Yeah, the zipper foot for bindings. I love it. I love it. I can just zip right through. All right, so let's take a good close look at the front corners. See how it forms this little folded line from the corner of our quilt to the very edge of our binding. And then on the back, it does the same little line from the corner to the corner. See that? Very nice, very nice. We joined our binding right there, and it's on a diagonal, same as the other joins, so you can't even tell where we started and stopped. And I added my little tag on the back, so there we go, there's that. And y'all, that wraps up this 16-week project. I love it. And you know what? I kind of love this binding on the quilt, even though I did not use this fabric anywhere else on this quilt. I love the back too. I used different fabrics for each one of the blocks on the back, just the same as the front. And I love this project. I think it's so much fun. Mary Jo, I will tell you, so this fabric here, I know you can't see it, it's right above my head off the camera. I have a crate on the wall. I have 2 crates. A fabric that belonged to my great aunt Avis. And this fabric was some of hers. The rest I bought new, I think. I don't know. I put all the links for the fabrics I used in the description box of the video. But this one fabric on this quilt was my great aunt Avis's. So I hope, even though it was a longer live and a longer video, I hope joining the blocks together and then to the quilt, I hope that part was helpful for some of you. Many of you already know how to do that, but a lot of you are brand new. And so I'm hoping that that was helpful to see it in real time, right? And then, of course, doing the binding. And I hope I didn't make it too confusing. But I love her. I love this quilt so much. Valerie said, I'm sad it's over. Well, I have good news, Valerie. Do you want to see what's coming up next? If you loved this, you're going to absolutely love that. Our next project. Yeah, Gloria, try your zipper foot and see what you think. I will tell you, I have to focus a lot less and just keep an eye on the zipper foot and is it touching my binding? And you just sew. Mavis said, I can't get my pattern to download. All right, Mavis, I'll tell you what, I'm going to come back to me. I'm going to put my email address up here. Well, this isn't my email address for my normal use, but I'm just going to put this up there. Send me an email, Mavis, to this email, and I'll email it to you, okay? That might be the easiest way for some of you to get it. Marie said none of it was confusing. Oh, good. Sometimes I think I confuse myself. All right. Well, while we're right here, this email, if you have, I know a lot of you have already emailed me, and I've added you to the list. I'm building an email list for any of you who want to join future Zoom workshops. They're free. We did one. All about the scan and cut. See my scan and cut? We did one, but we got bombarded by almost naked men dancing around on the floor. So I've made an email specific for joining those workshops in the future. If you want to join them, you can email me at this email address. All right, so let's take a look at our next quilt project, okay? I'm going to bring you back to the cutting mat for just a minute. Now, down in the description box, you'll find these 2 first pages. 2 pages. You can download this. This is our next quilt project. We're going to do Quilt As You Go again. Slightly different, though. No sashing strips on the back. Only sashing strips on the front. And these blocks are going to be different sizes. See that? Different size blocks. We have some patchwork piecing. And of course, I don't think it would be a Lisa Capen quilt without some applique. And more specifically, words. I love words. So we're going to do some applique, raw edge applique, and patchwork. Binding used to be my least favorite part of doing the quilt too, but now I've gotten to, when I get to the binding, I'm almost done, and so I just get this extra surge of energy to finish it up. But it used to be my most dreaded part of doing a quilt. I think once you do a few, you get more comfortable with it. So let's go over some of the details of this quilt. This quilt will be a little bit bigger than this one, right? Let me just hold this one up. This one is 20.5 by 20.5. So you can kind of see the size of this quilt, right? This one's going to be 32 by 36. So yeah, 32. That's a pretty good size. It's not a bed quilt. By 36 inches long. We're going to go through 10 weeks together, and this is going to bring us up shortly before Christmas. Okay? The blocks, the patterns are going to be free. The only thing, if you have a cutting machine like a Brother Scan and Cut, a Silhouette, a Cricut, and you like to cut your applique pieces out with your cutting machine, I will have those files in my Etsy shop. But the tracing templates for all the applique are in your free patterns each week, okay? So you don't have to buy anything to make this quilt. So I hope you follow along. I hope you tell your friends. Maybe y'all can do it as like a weekly get-together in person, right? Download the pattern and y'all get together and do it. But if you do want the cutting file, that will be in the Etsy shop, okay? So each week I've done all the patterns. I'm ready to get started. I just have to go shopping for fabric. So here's just a rundown of what you need, and it's not a lot. Many of you could probably pull right from your stash, okay? 2 yards of back fabric. 2 yards total of background fabric. And when I say background fabric, I'm talking about what the front of your applique blocks, right? That'll be your background fabric. 2 yards total. I might use tea stain muslin for all of it, which will give me a different look than this. I haven't decided yet. You'll need a quilt batting that's roughly 40 inches by 44 inches. You'll need 1/3 yard of binding fabric. You'll need 1 yard of fabric for your sashing strips. And again, we're only putting sashing on the front of this quilt. But it's like anything else. I hope I'm going to show you the way I'm going to do it. But if you have a different way you prefer to do it, by all means, do it that way. And of course, assorted size scraps for all your applique pieces, right? So when I say that, your scraps need to be bigger than the template pieces, right? And that's what you need. And of course, all the things that might be helpful for you would be a tracing box, fusible like Heat and Bond Light or Steam-A-Seam, whatever fusible you prefer, or freezer paper. I'm going to be using a 1-inch double-folded bias tape maker, y'all. You can pick those up at Joann's, Michael's, Hobby Lobby, your quilt shops. You can get one online. Many of you probably already have one. A silicone mat might be helpful. Y'all have seen me use that several times throughout this last series. Heat erasing pins might be helpful. You might want to do some hand stitching for some line work or some details of your applique. So like a DMC or pearl cotton thread and a hand sewing needle if you want to do that. You might want to use some beads and buttons for embellishments. And you also might instead want to use fabric markers. And of course, if you're sewing your applique down with the sewing machine, you'll want some coordinating threads. That sounds like a lot, but I'm willing to bet that most of you have most of that stuff already. Mary Jo said, that will give me some good practice with my scan and cut. Yes, it will. It will. Melissa said, is the cutting file going in all at once? No, so for each week, so let's take a look at block 1. Oh, the second page just tells you a little bit about what skill level, which I say even if you're brand new, please come join us. We will work you through it, right? And the times, and that it's a free project with an optional SVG file, right? So let's take a look at block 1. Block 1, we're doing some piecework. So there will be no SVG for week number 1. We're doing some piecing, right? So no SVG for that week. Block 2 is the little gingerbread man. So of course I do have all the tracing templates here for you to do it by hand. If you want the SVG, then that week, just like the day before, just like this past series, I will put the SVG in my Etsy shop. So you'll get block 2 that week, right? If you want it. And then block 3, we're doing snowmen. You have the tracing templates, but I will have the file in my shop for that week. Do you know what I'm saying? Jackie said, this will be my second quilt as you go. Thanks for showing us. I've enjoyed doing all the things. I'm so glad. I'm so glad. So, yep, we're just going to walk through. Some weeks we're going to do 2 blocks. I wanted to keep it a 10-week series, but there were 16 little blocks that make up this quilt, right? So some weeks we're doing 2 blocks that week so that we can keep it in a 10-week stretch. And I wanted to finish this quilt with about 2 weeks before Christmas so that you can hang it up. And if you happen to be watching this series on the replay, then you'll have plenty of time right before the following Christmas. But if you're sewing along with us weekly, I wanted you to be able to have some good amount of time to make this quilt with us and to enjoy it for Christmas, right? So we're going to be finishing this up about 2 weeks before Christmas. So it should be fun. Grammy said, can you just machine stitch the back side of the binding? Machine stitch? Yes. You can machine stitch it or you can hand stitch it. Y'all, I think we got a lot done in a short amount of time. It is just going on 2 hours. We did the applique for block 16. We joined 4 blocks together with the sashing strips. We joined that row to the other 3, and we did the binding. Just at 2 hours. That's a lot. But it also, in real time, shows you that you can, you know, in a couple hours, knock out a good amount of stuff. Mary Jo said, will you be showing how to add a sleeve or whatever you use to hang the quilt? Probably not, Mary Jo. I probably won't add a sleeve to my quilt. I'm really bad. Okay, can I just tell you? Do I have any close by? Let me just see. I'm really bad. I'm just going to tell you that a lot of the times I use, you might not want to do what I do. A lot of the times I use thumbtacks. Because I'm one of those people who like to put something up and then swap it out a week later and put something else up and swap it out. I use little clear thumbtacks. And they put the smallest little tiny holes in the wall that you can barely even see, right? That's what I do. I think I have a total of 2 quilts that I've ever made that I put a sleeve on. But I do know that there's lots of videos on YouTube, because I've seen them, showing you how to make a quilt sleeve and how to add it to the back of your quilt. And I don't like to push Patreon because I'm really not trying to sell Patreon. But we did do a workshop on quilt sleeves. And I think it was recorded, so you could go back and watch that. But the truth of the matter is I don't do quilt sleeves a lot. So but the joy of YouTube, y'all, is that there's just so much knowledge out there, and there's so many people who share their knowledge and are really good at doing it. So I don't think there's a shortage of quilt sleeve videos out there. Y'all, it's been so much fun. I know many of you, but I've also come to know many of you that are new to my channel. So I just want to thank all of y'all for following along in this series. I know a lot of y'all are not making this quilt, but you still followed along. Sheila, I saw your first block. Are you going to make any more, or you just did the one block? It looks so cute with the button in the middle. Susie, you followed along in the mystery quilt 4 years ago, and you've watched since. Yay! All right, goodbye, Miss Valerie. Thanks for watching. Anitra, yes, go get the family ready for camp. I'm glad you're starting to feel better. Lila, I'm so glad you're watching. Thank you so much. Miss Wanda. Miss Wanda, you got a new light pad during this series. How are you liking your light pad? Oh, you're going to make a few more, Sheila. That's awesome. Well, many of you are like Sheila. You're not really making this quilt per se, but you've been here every week. Can I just tell you, I am just so grateful for y'all. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for hanging out. Not just with me, but with everybody else who's here, right? Wanda, you love your light pad. I knew you would. Doesn't it make it so much easier? Yeah, Melissa, I know Fridays are usually crazy. Thanks for hanging out. Scrunchions, yeah, today was a little mini marathon for me. We finished up all the things. It is done. I'm going to use some thumbtacks and hang it up somewhere. Betty, I love you too. I sure do. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. And if you're watching on the replay, thanks for hanging out all the way to the end. I do know that between now and October 7th, when we start this, I will be coming live for a mug rug video, but I don't have a date for you. So I'm sorry that I don't have a date for you. I don't even have a design in mind yet. Oh, it's been a week. But I am knee deep in a t-shirt quilt, which you can't see anymore because I've rearranged. I have to focus on getting that t-shirt quilt done. And then I'm going to make up a pattern for a mug rug video. So I will see you before October the 7th for an evening live for a free mug rug tutorial. Marianne said, any recommendations for a certain light pad? Marianne, you're in luck. Okay, so in the description box, there's a link for this one. It's in the $19 to $21 range, right? It's an LED light pad. Mine's not plugged in right now, or else I'd turn it on and show you. But it's super light, and I love it. $19 to $21, depending on which link you use, right? But I love it. Mine's several years old, and it's still going strong. I love it. Ella, I'm sorry you're not feeling good. I hope you feel better. Aw, Mavis, your husband's sick. I'm so sorry. Wow, I hope, yeah, when he gets better. I hope that is soon. All right, and yeah, before we finish up today, there is one more link in the description box. We'll just hit on that before I go. For all the big blocks, some of y'all asked if I could group all the big blocks together. So I did. Many of you have shopped in my Etsy shop before. Please check your emails for a coupon or a discount code before, if you waited till the end to get all the big blocks grouped together. They've been on sale the week they come out, which has been probably cost effective wise the best way to get the big block patterns for all the things. But if you have shopped in my Etsy shop before, which many of you have, and you want to buy the bundle of all the patterns grouped together, please use the coupon code. Check your emails. And if you don't see me in your normal emails, check your spam folder, because my Etsy shop sends out coupon codes to returning buyers. Please use a coupon on that if you've waited to the end. Oh. Yeah, Sue said it's a great light box. Yeah, I love that. Ella said, can you try it with vinyl sometimes and see if it makes it easy to see weeding the lines? It does, Ella. It does. I don't know if I would be able to show how easy it makes it, because when I've tried to use the light pad, and sometimes I do during videos, but the light makes the camera funny. So you don't see what I see in person, but it really does. It helps make weeding vinyl a lot easier if you use the light pad. Especially like white vinyl, which I have a hard time seeing to weed. All right, everybody. I'm off to see if Harlan still has his suit coat on. He kind of likes to wear it around the house when he has to wear it. So I'm off to go spend some time with him and dive into adding some sashing to a t-shirt quilt. So until I see you one night before the 7th, or if you're on Patreon, I'll see you next week. I will be watching and following along over on Creative Crew. I still want to see your progress on all the things, so please keep sharing. And yeah, I hope y'all have a fantastic weekend, okay? I love y'all. Thanks for hanging out to the very, very end, where we're just chit-chatting and stuff. All right, everybody. Bye.